Back and thank you for clicking a Drachinifel video, Leif Ericson's ship. Yeah, we're talking about naval assets and such. The ship of Leif Erikson is probably one of the most interesting ships of all time. So let's jump in. Thank you for being here. Let's go. Let's learn. Ain't gonna look like that though. Yo, he's got a great intro. Yes, wow.
Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, is somewhat famous for being a Norseman who came across North America in the heyday of what would later popularly be called the Viking Age.
Yep. One of the most famous depictions of him right here. Don't we call this area Vinland?
But what kind of ship did he use to get there? It might be very tempting to just say a longship, as
A longship. Yeah. This is the typical thinner mast drafted version here.
of course Viking longships are what the Norse are most famous for. But looking a little closer at the sagas that talk about Leif Erikson's voyage, they mention some very specific clues. Firstly, longship is in the modern day generally used as a catch-all term for Viking warship, whereas in fact there were several different types of ship that could be used for war in Norse culture, something
Okay.
I'll probably have to do a video about at
Yeah, because I'm kind of like bucketing them all in the same.
some other point. But secondly, a longship, to use the shorthand, had a lot of oars, a shallow draft, and fairly low sides. That doesn't make for the best kind of vessel to cross the North Atlantic, even in stages. Further, when we look more closely at the relevant sagas, although most of the time they use generic terms that are now normally rendered as ship, there are some further clues as to the type of vessel. Firstly, rowing is barely mentioned. The only time I could find where the Norsemen themselves actually row something is when they're using one of their ship's boats.
Okay, that's interesting and very interesting. So, but I mean, that also, wouldn't it be hard to just row out in the middle of the Atlantic?
Every other reference to rowing is when the locals that they come across are rowing their own craft. Secondly, when faced with contrary winds and such like, there is instead reference to problems sailing the ship. No one during the saga seems to think about just lowering the sail and rowing in the direction they want to go, even when they're in quite significant peril.
Okay.
And of course, the ship's sailing to and from various places is mentioned quite a bit. Thirdly, several times they come across areas they want to explore on the coast of what they term Vinland, and they send out small parties on the ship's boat, instead of just landing the ship itself. Although, admittedly, the ships are also landed in suitable places at times. Now, given the very shallow draft of a longship, you would expect such a vessel to be able to just go ahead and land on almost any beach worth looking at, because, well, that was one of their major strengths. So all of these clues, along with more general knowledge about the type of vessels that were actually used to traverse from Scandinavia to Iceland and Greenland most of the time,
It might be deeper.
suggest that the vessel being used by Leif Erikson was probably a Nar.
Oh, how do you say that? Closed captions. A nah. Okay.
This is also something of a catch-all term, but broadly it describes Norse merchant and trade ships as opposed to warships,
Okay, so more expeditionary.
at least the ocean-going ones. These were generally somewhat shorter than the average warship, but they had higher sides, deeper drafts, sometimes a wider beam, and significantly fewer oars, just enough to get the ship in and out of harbour where the wind may not be in existence.
Like a big canoe, isn't it?
As well as being the more general type of ship that is known to be used in the North Atlantic by the Norse, This would also explain many of the details found in the sagas. A deeper draft Nar would be less able to just run up on any beach, and so the ship's boat, which, due to its greater internal volume, it would have more capacity to carry.
So what is that on the on the left right there? That looks like a some sort of oar anchor thingy. That's what is that?
Would then be used significantly more often, and the fact there are very few oars aboard would mean that sail was the only realistic means of propulsion when they're in the open sea, even when faced with contrary conditions.
Is that like the steer? I can imagine like is that so how you steer it?
There are also references in the sagas to extensive amounts of supplies being taken aboard, which is much more plausible in a Nar, which had the hold space to accommodate them.
Whole space. Okay.
So, what was a Nar like? Well, since Nar is a broad term, their size and capacity would have varied quite wildly, and very few wrecks of Nars have actually been found to give us some physical evidence. But, based on the two best documented wrecks that are confirmed to be Nars, you would generally expect such a vessel to be made of oak, with a clinker-built hull, that is, with planks overlapping each other rather than
Interesting. Okay.
abutting each other, it between 50 and 75 feet in length and 16 to 20 feet wide, with a cargo capacity of 30 to 60 tons and a minimum crew requirement of 6 to 10 people,
Okay. Not that big.
although the sagas suggest considerably more were present on Leif Ericson's ship, which is understandable, as exploration and merchant ventures would very often have a larger complement either to just help man the ship or partially as passengers looking for new places to be.
Can you imagine though, like being in a ship in the open waters in, you know, the 10th century, the 11th century, whatever, and you are on a ship with like 15 other people, animals, and like you can't see a horizon, like or any land on the horizon, and like you're just out there, and everyone's going to the bathroom off the ship. You're eating the rations. You're dealing with cows or cattle and or whatever that you're bringing along to have subsistence. You're kind of like perilously going into the unknown. What an interesting voyage.
As well as a large single mast and sail, plus a steering oar on the starboard side, such a ship would actually have two partial decks,
This just looks too harmonious right here. I think it would be much more chaotic
one at the bow and the other at the stern, with the open hold amidships that
and way more people.
use the keel and the outer planking as its deck. In theory, there was enough depth to the sides of the ship to rig up a basic shelter from awnings or perhaps carried tents in very hot or rainy weather to keep the ship somewhat more sheltered, but the generally open nature of the vessel meant that bailing it out was a semi-regular job in most conditions and frequently referenced. The Nar would continue to evolve as a merchant vessel over time, developing higher and higher sides and a deeper draft, as well as just growing generally larger, eventually merging with other northern European shipbuilding
Whoa, you got like towers.
traditions to give rise to the more general medieval cog, a typical trading vessel of that period
Oh,
that, at least in some earlier depictions from areas where the Norse lived prior to the installation of fighting castles and central rudders, does greatly resemble an enlarged Nar.
That's it for this video.
wow. Very quick video, but very informative. So we learned what a Nar is. We learned that the longships are more or less a parent category, and that this is kind of like the depiction of the lifestyle of being on that ship. Let me know what you guys think in terms of any other context around this. If you have some specific videos, maybe related to these voyages or Leif Erikson or Vinland or whatever, it'd be interesting to watch with you guys on this channel. Appreciate you as always. Peace out. Bye bye.